UNITEAM versus DDS Civil War. Radio broadcaster killed on air. At Japanese Prime Minister bumisita. Kumusta for me? This is Avor Joseph and welcome to News I Deem Worthy Recap Weekly Edition number 24. We have tons and tons of news and new stuff to cover for the second week of November 2023. Skip to the timestamps provided if it piques your interest. Maganda na for the blazing sector summation. Here are some PH News commentary for your convenience. Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida addresses the Philippine Congress amid Chinese threat. Japanese Prime Minister Kishida, or Fumio Kishida, or kung ano man ang gusto mong itawag sa kanya,
Fumio Kishida
visited the Philippines, subsequently the whole Southeast Asia region, and addressed the joint session of Congress convening the Senate and the House of Representatives last 3rd of November and promptly left the next day. Kumbaga, gusto niya na tayo kausapin, makipag-hi, blah, 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 and bye. Now, you might ask, why did he come here? Well, as you can see, it's all about bolstering ties to our nation amid crisis in the South China Sea, and most definitely and probably the only reason kung bakit siya bumisita sa Pilipinas ay dahil sa Taiwan, or at least to safeguard Chinese Taipei or Taiwanese independence and the backup against looming threats of the People's Republic of China's takeover. Kung iisipin mo, bakit sila masyadong press sa issue ng Taiwanese independence or at least Chinese Taipei's independence or rebellious state? Well, Taiwan has the most advanced chips that will be needed for any kind of electronic, from the most rudimentary, which are like the cell phone na nanay mo puday, to the more sophisticated stuff na ginagamit sa quantum computing. Basta they make good chips. And it would take so long for the US and even China to catch up. That's why kailangan nilang i-safeguard yung kanilang stake sa Taiwanese independence. And if got their hand on the Taiwanese manufacturing chips, well, it would be a huge fuck up sa US, especially since nagkaroon sila ng trade block or at least blockade ng mga chips kung saan hindi nila pinapayagan ng US companies or even US adjacent companies na makapag-work sa China using their chips. Which is actually frightening since even after that chip blockade or technological blockade na ginawa ni, I think, Trump or Biden, Huawei released a phone that is actually like 6 nanometers on chip. And the most cutting edge is around 4 nanometers from Taiwan. That's basically the gist of the conflict, or at least that's why the US is so adamant at protecting Taiwanese sovereignty. Tatanungin mo sa akin, well, how credible is that threat, you may ask? Well, you can ask Xi himself, where he said they are preparing for a war because China needs to invade Taiwan sooner rather than later. Not just because of the Taiwanese chips na sinasabi kong like the most out-of-the-way chips or cutting-edge chip that US companies can't even come close to, especially Chinese. China needs to invade Taiwan sooner rather than later, and while Taiwan is still militarily speaking weak compared to the PRC, even with the US aid and explicit support ni Biden, which is actually a huge issue considering the US has been operating under the guise of strategic ambiguity where they don't explicitly recognize Taiwanese independence, and actually they have revoked their recognition of Taiwanese independence in favor of the PRC. Kasi nga, PRC is getting larger and larger in the 90s or 2000s. Pero even with all of that, they still use their doublespeak or yung kanilang strategic ambiguity sa kanilang pag-describe sa Formosa o Taiwan, and their clear distinction sa PRC in the mainland China and the Taiwanese island. Tinanggal ng 46 US President Joseph Robinette Biden ang kanyang ability to have a sort of cloud or mist para hindi naman siya ganun ka-explicit in regarding sa Taiwanese sovereignty in the region, especially with the looming threat against China. And the Philippines is in what they call as the first island chain, consisting of, I think, Japan, Taiwan itself, and the Philippines. That first island chain contains the PRC or the People's Republic of China. Syempre, it's understandable na yung China, of course, medyo nagiging claustrophobic kasi on the other side, they have their frenemy, which is India, even na kasama sila sa BRICS or Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Kahit magkakasama sila doon sa whole bubble ngayon, sa BRICS, India and China has a very tense relationship. Nagiging claustrophobic na yung China kasi nga hindi naman talaga siya dapat contained just in that space alone. Kasi nga, ang gusto nila magkaroon ng multipolar world. Now, ano ba ibig sabihin ng multipolar world? Kumaga, ayaw lang nilang magkaroon ng US domination sa buong mundo. Just like what US has had since 1991 after the fall of the Soviet Union at yung subsequent breakup ng USSR. Gusto nilang magkaroon ng multipolar world kung saan hindi lang US yung may hegemony over the entire globe, especially economically and politically speaking. Of course, China will be understandably quite irate with their neighbors getting closer and closer with their enemy, aka the NATO/US/the Western world. The Philippines was notified of Prime Minister Fumio
Kishida.
his plan to visit way back in July, returning the favor when President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. visited last February when Japan pledged to provide 600 billion yen or katumbas ng 250 billion pesos on February. Though actually today, minus 25 billion pesos na yun kasi nga the yen has been in decline for so long. And I don't want to be a doomer pero it seems it will be trending downwards. In the speech made at the Philippine Congress, Fumio Kishida, yung Prime Minister ng Japan, warned of an impending and imminent threat in the national and international security in the Philippines and Indo-Pacific region dahil nga, even if he didn't really say it, China is the only reason he even visited the Philippines. Para protektahan yung kanilang interest in the Indo-Pacific region, especially with their support at saka syempre align sila with the US. He said some stuff about the imminent and legitimate threat the Philippines face going toe-to-toe in the West Philippine Sea against state actors that violate the rule of law. Basically, the UNCLOS or United Nations Conventions on the Laws of Sea at yung arbitral ruling na napanalo ni Ninoy Aquino back in 2016 or is it 2017? I'm not really sure. Kumbaga, pinapasaringan niya yung China but of course, he can't really outright say it because that would be a diplomatic disaster. Not to mention, we don't want to provoke China into doing anything drastic. And of course, gusto nila i-contain yung PRC or People's Republic of China because it threatens the US hegemony. This is amid the constant violent and unstatesmanly encounter of the Philippines Coast Guard with the Chinese Coast Guard as they get bombarded with water cannons, blinding lasers, and literal ramming of boats. So you'll understand why the Philippines is less likely to view the Chinese as their friend. Even with a huge Pinoy population, the Philippines and Japan has announced negotiations for the Reciprocal Access Agreement o RAA. Ito yung Defense Cooperation Pact na katulad ng Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement ng EDCA na tinanggal ni, I think, Duterte at binalik ni Marcos noong nakaraan lamang, which basically resulted into more bases or US military bases, most in the northern region of the Philippines, around or near Taiwan and the Taiwan Strait or Luzon Strait, and also the one in Palawan. But yeah, yung pagpayag ni President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. sa EDCA sites ng US is a significant na development sa US and Filipino relationship because we've been moving away from the US and closer towards China both economically and politically, especially since our leader, former President Rodrigo Roa Duterte, is in chums with China and even visited China last few months ago. Basically, yung Reciprocal Access Agreement o yung RAA ay mutual access to troops for military trainings and operations. That's what they are entailing. Just like the EDCA's constant trainings in the region. We're basically, again, being a pawn in the US's hegemony game. Japan has also promised to send the Philippines 12 ships and radar systems for the Philippine Air Force and Philippine Navy. Of course, numerous progressive groups have protested against the Reciprocal Access Agreement. I mean, it's basically akin or basically a carbon copy of the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement of the US, as it will most likely be going to be used to undermine our sovereignty or at least yung ating independence to act against aggressors of other countries or even in our borders. It's basically making us a tentacle or an extension nung American imperialism. The Philippine National Police has also confirmed it has been investigating reports of sleeper cells planted by China in the Philippines awaiting orders by the Communist Party of China to wreak havoc and destabilize the government due to its amiable relationship with the United States and NATO allies. Basically saying, oh, nandito yung Japanese Prime Minister? Well, the only reason he's there is because of China and fanning the flames of anti-China rhetoric. And what better propaganda than sleeper cells in the Philippines. To be fair, this is bullshit. Those pogo hubs na nakikita nila in the country isn't a sign of possible sleeper cells in the Philippines. Nandiyan lang siya para sa gambling and sometimes a front for scams, which is why almost every day we hear of pogo hubs being raided for cryptocurrency scams, even some adult website thingamajig. Pero they're just that, gambling and possible front for scams. Now, I'm not saying na hindi ito posible because, I'm not omniscient. I don't think there are any sleeper cells in the country. It's just really not that credible of a source kasi wala naman silang sinight na source regarding that. They just said, merong reports. Although, what reports are they talking about? China's rarely, if ever, intervened in internal affairs of international governments. I mean, Russia, I understand, sure. Pero China, I don't think so. Although, I don't think we can rule out any desperate attempts by foreign countries to undermine our sovereignty and destabilize the Philippine government or at least make it a puppet state. I'm talking about US, if you're not catching up. This is just some show the PNP is doing to amp up anti-Chinese sentiment in a country with a pretty large Filipino-Chinese population, and not to mention, kakabisita lang sa atin ni Prime Minister Fumio Kishida. They're in cahoots, basically, or at least, they're trying to look good for the Japanese. Radio broadcaster killed on air. In a chilling live stream on Facebook around 5 in the morning, a Misamis Occidental radio broadcaster was shot live on air. The radio broadcaster fatally shot was identified to be 57-year-old Juan Humalon, also known as DJ Johnny Walker, in his home. The gunman was said to have pretended to be lost and asking for direction, and when gained an opening to the gate, hurriedly pointed the gun at the two people na nagbabantay sa gate, basically yung mga guards, and of course, they cowered because, who wouldn't? While the other quickly came inside the house, basically parang alam nila yung layout ng bahay, to kill Johnny Walker sa kanyang bahay while broadcasting live on air sa Facebook at sa radio, shooting him twice and then snatching his necklace. Numerous groups have condemned the killing of the journalist and emphasized the grave threat journalists face on a day-to-day basis due to their line of work. And yes, that is an adamant and particularly jarring case in our region. Kasi the first Nobel Peace Prize na nakuha ng isang Pilipino ay dahil sa kanyang reporting or at least yung pagsisiwalat sa gobyernong Duterte or administrasyong Duterte sa kanyang war on drugs and basically a lot of journalist killing, freedom of speech at syempre yung press freedom sa ating bansa. DJ Johnny Walker o Juan Humalon was the fourth journalist killed under President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. when he took office since June 2022 and the second journalist killed this year. Those being Ray Blanco on September 18, 2022, the high-profile Percy Lapid case on October 3, 2022, and Cresciano Bundungin on May 31st, 2023, almost all of them unresolved. Pero I'm not saying that this gruesome crime is connected to the journalist's profession. However, the killing of a journalist is still a killing of a journalist, whatever the motive may be, and those insisting it without accounting for various other reasons should not lead us to dismiss this type of gruesome crime as just happenstance. And those insisting that it is, like it's an attack on press freedom, or at least that specific case, hindi ako masyadong convinced. Of course, you have to account for various other reasons such as the live stream itself showing said necklace and other personal matters unaccounted for. Especially, I think Juan Humalon won a case for the land kung saan nakatirik yung radio station. But, as I said, even if itong gruesome crime na to is not connected to the journalist's profession, that doesn't mean that it should undermine the people who was in fact killed due to the nature of their profession or beliefs. Just because itong high-profile case na to, or at least itong gruesome crime na nangyari dito, ay not connected to the line of work being a journalist. I mean, if we dismiss the death of one entertainment journalist as just happenstance, it could also lead us to disregard in a slippery slope and categorize many journalists' death as just that, happenstance. We should not undermine the death of this particular journalist even if hindi connected yung krimen or yung pagpatay sa kanyang trabaho. Because if we do that, then it's a slippery slope of people assuming, hey, I mean, it's just happenstance. Tignan mo yung nangyari dito. I mean, we need safeguards and ample protection for our journalists. I stand with those calling to stop the attacks against journalists, activists, and political leaders by numerous interests and armed groups plotting to reduce checks and balances and their shady dealings that shed light upon by our journalists, activists, and political leaders. Pwedeng gamitin ng tao in power, or at least those na may kinalaman sa pagpatay when they are in fact killed due to their line of profession or belief. Pwede nilang gamitin itong case na to kung saan with this outrage, ganito kalaking outrage, it turns out to be not connected to his work. Philippine Statistics Authority Inflation and Unemployment Report October 2023 and September 2023. Ayon sa Philippine Statistics Authority, bumaba ang inflation rate ng Pilipinas ng mahigit 1.2% from 6.1% noong September to 4.9% noong nakaraang Oktubre 2023. Ngunit mas mataas pa rin ang inflation rate ng bansa para sa bottom 30% ng income households, kumbaga yung poorest of the poor, na umabot sa 5.3%, samantalang 7.6% naman ang inflation rate para sa food and non-alcoholic beverages. Basically, mas mahal pa rin talaga ang pagiging mahirap. Hindi hamak na mas mababa rin ang inflation rate ng Pilipinas noong October 2022 na umabot sa 7.7% inflation rate. Para naman sa unemployment rate ng bansa, para sa September 2023, bahagyang umakyat ng 0.1% ang unemployment rate sa September compared to the unemployment rate noong Agosto 2023. Mas mababa naman ng 0.5% ang unemployment rate ng Pilipinas ngayong September 2023 kung ikukumpara sa September 2022 statistic. Mas mababa naman ang labor force participation rate from 65.2% last year to just 64.1% this year. Samantalang bumaba rin ang underemployment rate, which is actually a good thing, from 15.4% last September 2022 to just 10.7% ngayong September 2023 and less than 1% from August underemployment of 11.7%. Umakit din ang antas ng ating gross domestic product para sa ikatlong quarter ng 2023 to 5.9%. Ang mga growth drivers ng bansa para sa ikatlong quarter ng taon ay 1. Construction at 14%, 2. Financial and insurance activities at 9.5%, at number 3, 5.0% for repair of motor vehicles and motorcycles. Here are some more PH news for your convenience. 2024 budget approved in Congress. The House of Representatives has approved and sent over the House Bill 89080 or the Revised General Appropriations Bill for the 5.768 trillion peso budget for 2024 and a Senate to the Senate for the deliberation, which included the 194.5 billion pesos worth of amendments or at least yung pagbabago sa ipinresenta ng Department of Budget and Management and President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. to the original bill, yung kanilang in-sponsor, and reallocation of 1.23 billion pesos worth of confidential fund. Well, saan ba nanggaling yung 1.23 billion pesos na yun? Anong ahensya ang meron noon na tinanggalan nito? I mean, matapos ang walang hanggang diskusyon tungkol sa confidential at intelligence funds, tinanggalan na ng 4-person House Appropriations Committee ang 5 sibil na ahensya ng gobyerno with an amounting total to around 1.23 billion pesos na sinasabing i-reallocate to preservation and protection of our territorial assertions in the West Philippine Sea. Although 1.23 billion pesos lang, are we sure that's enough to a $17 trillion economy? The second largest spending country in terms of military. Ang mga ahensyang tinanggalan ng Confidential and Intelligence Fund ay ang mga sumusunod. Office of the Vice President, na nag-request ng 500 million pesos in Confidential at Intelligence Fund, Department of Education for 150 million pesos, both under VP SARA Duterte, Department of Agriculture, then under President Ferdinand Marcos Jr., pero ngayon, it's now Francisco Chu Laurel or something, for 50 million pesos CIF, Department of Information and Communications Technology for 300 million pesos CIF, at Department of Foreign Affairs amounting to 50 million CIF. So, pag pinag-add mo sila. Many from the opposition called on President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. to give up the 4.56 billion pesos, which was almost half of the CIF request of the 5 trillion peso budget at yung kanyang 10 billion requested Office of the President budget. Senate President Juan Miguel Zubiri has promised to pass the legislation na pinasa ng Congress and carry it over to President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. before the end of the year. Congress fires back against Duterte UNITEAM versus DDS Civil War. Nagkaisang almost unilateral House of Representatives sa pagpasa ng resolusyon patungkol sa mga pasaring at akusasyon ng korupsyon at alegasyon ng kotsabahan sa Kongreso, pati na ang pagbabanta sa buhay ng isang oposisyong kongresista na si Axis Representative Franz Castro.
Pero ang una mong target sa intelligence fund mo, ikaw, Franz. Kayong mga komunista ang gusto kong patayin. Sabihin mo na sa kanya. Pero ang una mong target sa intelligence fund mo, ikaw, Franz.
Kahit na walang sinabing pangalan sa nasabing resolusyon, I mean, we all know naman na it was Duterte. Nagbitiw pa nga sa posisyon ng PDP laban, ang dating partido ni Duterte, ang isang kongresista bago i-name drop kung sino nga ba talaga ang pinatutunguhan ng nasabing resolusyon.
The name of that accuser so sacrosanct that we cannot mention it before this body.
Before I will answer, I will resign now as member and officer of PDP Laban. The former President Rodrigo Roa Duterte.
I mean, we all know naman na it was Duterte. Especially with all of his tirades sa SMNI News Channel. Actually, lumipat ang 31, I think, galing sa PDP laban to Marcos's party. Honestly, with all the commotion and the Congress turning against Duterte dahil pinilit niya, or at least ininsist niya, na may pork barrel at confidential funds rin ang House of Representatives dahil sa pagtanggal ng House Committee on Appropriations ng mahigit 650 million confidential fund ng kanyang panganay na si Vice Presidente at Department of Education Secretary SARA Duterte. Well, you know, masyado siyang nagalit and the Congress can't bear it anymore. Naging hot button issue ang confidential funds dahil sa umanay illogical at prone to misappropriation of funds ng daang milyones na confidential and intelligence fund ng Vice Presidente. I mean, kahit si Marcos, hindi madepensahan yung hinihingi ni Education Secretary Sara Duterte na 150 million pesos kasi nga, bakit naman niya kakailanganin gamitin yung mga confidential funds as the Secretary of a civil department of the government that was supposed to be focusing on the children's future and, you know, education. Now, beyond the confidential funds issue, the fight between the Marcoses and Dutertes goes far back since Duterte's mother and VP Sara's grandmother, who was an adamant protester against the Marcoses and allied with the Aquinos. The Dutertes and Aquinos were in good terms up until like 2016 when Duterte ran for president kung saan tinanggal niya yung kanyang yellow ribbon. Dilawan si Duterte at least pre-2016. Sinuportahan pa nga niya si Aquino at si Mar Rojas sa kanilang presidential at vice presidential bid para sa 2010 elections. Now, more recently, umalis si Vice President Sara Duterte sa partido ni House Speaker Martin Romualdez, the cousin of the President Ferdinand Marcos Jr., and Arroyo was demoted from her senior deputy speaker position at itinalaga sa deputy speaker position lamang. Itinalagang kingmaker si Arroyo ngunit matapos ang eleksyon, para siyang isinantabi lamang. Nasa ibang bansa si Pampanga Representative at former President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo nang ipasa ang nasabing resolusyon sa Kamara where kinabukasan ay tinanggal siya sa kanyang posisyon as the Deputy House Speaker. I mean, what a fall from grace. I mean, from kingmaker to senior Deputy Speaker position, tapos binaba siya into just Deputy Speaker position to just, since the majority wanted to fire back against the tirades na kanilang nare-receive from Duterte and adjacent si Arroyo sa cause ni VP Sara Duterte at President Rodrigo Roa Duterte. Kahit na sinabi ni Gloria Arroyo na sinusuportahan niya ang leadership ni House Speaker Martin Romualdez, even with all the commotion regarding House Speakership at ang pagsasantabi sa kanya, she still supports Martin Romualdez's leadership in the House of Representatives kahit ilang beses siyang isinantabi. After the dust has settled and matapos bumaba ang rating ni VP Sara Duterte, she rescinded her request for the 650 million peso confidential fund na impressively dug out by the opposition considering their lowly numbers in the House and Senate, saying she won't pursue the confidential fund allotments probably because it's too much of a hassle kasi ang daming commotion sa social media at sa mga constituents ng mga congressmen na even if they are aligned with Duterte, the PR disaster of supporting the confidential fund is just too much for them to bear. And mukhang magkakaroon naman talaga ng rift against President Ferdinand Marcos Jr., Vice President Sara Duterte. considering nilagay siya sa posisyon ng DepEd Secretary instead of the Department of Defense. Even with all that, kahit na iniresign niya na yung kanyang request for the 650 million peso confidential fund, ipa-realign niya na lang or ipa-transfer niya na lang galing sa contingency fund kung saan merong nakalaang budget para sa mga hindi sakop na proyekto na pwedeng ibigay ng presidente sa kanyang underlings or at least sa mga departamento at ahensya to do whatever they want. Yun ang contingency fund na sinasabi nilang legal ang pag-transfer kahit na walang line item. Katulad nung ginawa niya para sa 125 million peso confidential fund na ginastos in just 11 days. Tuloy pa rin ang mahigit 10 billion peso budget of the Office of the President, almost half of which are consisting of confidential and intelligence fund o 2.25 billion in confidential at 2.31 billion in intelligence fund for the fiscal year 2024. Meralco electricity hike. Nag-anunsyo ang Meralco ng dagdag na singil para sa paparating na bill ngayong November na aabot sa 23 cents per kilowatt hour na dagdag na singil atop the 46 cent per kilowatt hour noong October, bringing the overall rate ng mga merong 200 kilowatt hour consumption household into 12 pesos and 5 cents per kilowatt hour. Ang additional price hike ay magiging katumbas ng 47 pesos sa kumokonsumo ng 200 kilowatt hours, 70 pesos sa 300 kilowatt hours, 94 pesos sa 400 kilowatt hours, at dagdag na 117 pesos para sa kumokonsumo ng 500 kilowatt hours na kuryente kada buwan. Dahil umano ito sa transmission charge hike dahil sa pagtaas ng service or at least yung service charge ng National Grid Corporation of the Philippines o NGCP na pumapasinayas or sa electrical grids ng Pilipinas na nakikipagbangayan ngayon sa ERC o Energy Regulatory Commission dahil sa umano'y overregulation o yung masyadong intervention ng ahensya ng gobyernong ito sa kumpanya dahil sa pagpoprotekta ng ERC sa pagpasa ng dagdag singil ng mga consumer ng mga dagdag na singil na kuryente dahil sa mga ginastos ng NGCP. At yan ang pagtatapos ng News I Deemed Worthy Recap Weekly Edition for roughly the second week of November 2023. Mag-suggest some more topics and or corrections to balitas if you felt I misrepresented them in any way. Salamat sa mga panonood mga kabayang. For me, like, subscribe, and follow my links in socials and avoid Joseph that would be linked down below. Sa susunod muli, paalam.